Andrew. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this live breakout. Once again, my name is Mandi McKay. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Social Responsibility for Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. Hopefully, you are joining us after watching my previous conversation with Joel and Andrew. If not, I'll give a brief recap of that, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing people's questions and a good conversation around what we talked about. And so I'll briefly go again and introduce Joel and Andrew. So Joel is with the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and Andrew is with Planet. And again, our last conversation, we had a really good, about 30-minute conversation about a month ago. So just forewarning for everybody, if you we haven't talked since then. So this is live and raw, if you will. But we had a really good conversation around the interconnection between conservation and technology. So we highlighted the urgent call for land and water conservation across the globe to prevent rapid loss of species biodiversity that we've seen for decades, really, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. But also the fact that land and water conservation can also lead to our resilience towards climate change. So if you think about wetlands or forests, healthy ecosystems and the nature-based climate solutions that provides, and all the ecosystem services that we rely on, right, for our own needs, but also for the plant and animals that also rely on those ecosystems. We then talked about how technology, through data, science, remote sensing, satellites, bring life and really kind of some robustness and bolsters those conservation efforts in a couple ways. One, it's real time, so we can actually be more precise and accurate with the work that is being done across the globe. We can see it. And that's the accessibility. We talked a lot about how technology makes this more accessible. So if you can actually see the work that's being done and make it more local to you, it helps with education. It helps us understand where we really need to put resources and effort. So we really talked about how those two come together for this, what we call kind of precision conservation. So great conversation again, thanks to Joel and Andrew. So what I'm really looking forward to is hearing from all of you your questions on either biodiversity and conservation or how the technology plays into that. And I want to remind people, it looks like we've got things in the chat, but you can, if you'd like to come on and we can see your face to ask a question, that would be great. Just share your audio visual and I'll bring you up on stage, or just throw your question in the chat and I'll monitor that as well. So I'm going to go through here real quick. Okay, it looks like we do have a question already from Charles. He says, we hear of the regenerative agriculture practice being applied on the land, but in terms of the sea, it is just bad news from temperature rise, CO2 carbon sequestration, sea species, overfishing, etc. What can commerce do to reverse the problem of the oceans as opposed to shifting it onto another area?
I'd be happy to wade in to that question, Joel, and would be delighted to hear your perspective as well. You know, it's a really interesting and complicated time, obviously, for ocean conservation. The trends are not great, and in many places they're moving away from us. On the other hand, one of the things we know is that continuous measurement and observation actually, we know, delivers conservation outcomes. So at our organization at Planet, we've been working on efforts particularly to monitor coastal areas and marine areas. And I'll give just two examples where things are interesting. One is, I think we actually just in Marseille in a week's time will be announcing that we've completed the mapping of all of the world's coral reefs. That effort actually led to the identification of numerous biodiversity hotspots around the world that were unknown and essentially unmapped, and now have been turned into new marine protected areas. So the first thing we know is that if we make the invisible visible, that's the first step toward that transparency is the first step toward greater accountability and ultimately to conservation outcomes. The second one is a little more involved, and that is that, you know, we've seen an ability to begin to slow processes, say, of deforestation on the land by continuously monitoring the carbon assets, for instance, in the forest. Now, forests provide enormous, the Amazon provides enormous amounts of biodiversity and enormous amounts of conservation, and value, ecosystem services, and countless other things. And we've seen that by continuously monitoring these assets from space and these ecosystems from space, that we can improve conservation outcomes. And that's beginning to be applied to a new domain called coastal blue carbon. Mangroves and seagrasses and wetlands and a number of other estuarial systems contain sometimes as much or more carbon than our terrestrial forests. And they are also critical habitats. And so we're starting to use the same tools of monitoring and observing from space to be able to build systems and programs that protect these vital areas. And so I think the news has not of late been great, but these technologies are now putting us in a position where we can do some really powerful things. We're working on both of those problems and supporting organizations like Global Fishing Watch, which uses satellites and remote sensing technology to track dark fleets around the world, where they and to keep them out of protected areas. So these technologies are really starting to have an impact, and I think we're going to see more of an impact in the years to come. Joel?
Yeah, that was a great answer, Andrew. And I, as I was listening to it, I thought about a number of different points where biodiversity is kind of an important part of that conversation of protecting our, basically restoring and protecting our oceans. Because I think, that's kind of at the core of regenerative agriculture is restoration. And obviously, I think we're still very much in the protection phase when it comes to the world's seas. A couple things to bear in mind, and I think Andrew was making this point really well. It's also about where are the right places and what are the right places to protect. So we need to use technology, manpower, citizen science, all those tools to identify and map our oceans. So, I'm sure you all have probably heard it, but we have a better understanding of the surface of Mars and Venus than we do of our oceans, and that is very true. Dawn Wright is a oceanographer and the chief scientist at Esri, who's a partner of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and also with Planet. And Dawn basically wrote an op-ed a few days ago talking about the need for us to map our oceans. We've only mapped, I think about 13% of the oceans, which is, it's kind of a ridiculous number. And most of that, I think, has been done in the last 10 years, just in the last 10 years. And so what's really interesting is when we talk about biodiversity is often concentrated in our oceans. There are vast spaces in our oceans that are simply not very biodiverse. But when you get to places like coral reefs, of course, that's where the life is concentrated. That's where the variety of organisms can be found. So in some cases, when we think about marine protection and the future of marine protection, we have to think about place. And then, of course, it's a dynamic, fluid ecosystem constantly changing. And so we will have to have a deep understanding of species migration and travel. There's a wonderful story that just came out, again, a couple of days ago about a manatee that for the last 20 years or so has been traveling from the Gulf Coast, not the Gulf Coast, Florida, but the east coast of Florida, I believe, as far north as the Chesapeake Bay here and back in its regular migration. Amazing creature. And it's something like 20, 25 years old, this manatee. And, we just think of manatees as being, off the coast of Florida, but in fact, they have a broad, great, large range. And so when we think about protecting diversity, trying to safeguard species, we really need to take into consideration migration. That's one of the reasons why we need to take the things that we're learning on land, like regenerative agriculture, wildlife corridor reconnection, and we need to be applying some of that thinking to our seas.
That was a great question, Charles. Thank you for that, for getting us going. I see that there's quite a few more people that have joined, which is great. If you have just joined, Mandi, Joel, Andrew, we're talking about conservation and technology, how those join forces, and hopefully you've watched our previous conversation, but we're really looking to hear questions from you. So if you've got anything you want to ask related to biodiversity or how technology supports that work, conservation in general, there's a lot in the news right now around 30 by 30 resolutions, whether that's at the state level or at the federal level. We now have a 30 by 30 resolution from the Biden administration. So certainly a hot topic, at least going on right now, in its intersection with climate change. And again, all the interrelated benefits that come with preserving and protecting land and water, local, regional, global scale. I'm looking for questions. Again, if anyone has anything you'd want to ask, throw it in the chat, or say you want to share your audio and video and we'll bring you up on stage. Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you brought up, Mandi, 30 by 30, and one of the things that 30 by 30 is doing, which is powerful in its own right, is it's making conservation organizations, government agencies, NGOs, and all of their partners like Planet and many other technology companies, mapping companies, kind of now start to go, collaborate and I think get out of some of the silos that we've been in and start having a conversation about, again, where and what are these right places. And so there are forces that are naturally going to come up that sort of say, politicize the effort and call the 30 by 30 effort a land grab or anti-privatization, privatization. But the reality is that conservation organizations have been working with both public and private sector for decades on meaningful conservation and preservation. Mm-hmm. What we haven't done a really great job at in the last, and it's changing in the last decade, but we need to do more, is partnering with NGOs and technology companies to identify how to amplify and speed up our work, how to make it more valuable, to actually provide more confidence in the data that nonprofits and are working with, and also the scientific sector, which tries to stay impartial, nonpartisan, but oftentimes the data gets politicized. So 30 by 30, you've got this immediate question, which was the same question that was asked 5 years ago when the Half Earth concert came up, which is which half, right? And so now people are going, which 30, right? And what matters is, from a biodiversity perspective, is that those places are picked very, very carefully, and that we understand the species that are there, and we also understand that where we have future opportunities to safeguard even more species, than the threshold that's necessary to kind of protect all life on Earth.
It's a great point, Joel, and I sort of picking up on that theme. I think sometimes this is a challenge for biodiversity conservation science discussions in some of the same ways that climate change and climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience are complicated discussions, because the public discourse doesn't match the kind of conceptual firmament that we're working with now. And what I think about, just to pick out two examples, when we use these terms like 30 by 30, we sort of have this idea that we're going to lop off a big chunk of the earth and we're going to make gigantic parks. And in some cases we are, and we should, because the ecological science tells us that these places need, we need afforestation, not just reforestation. We need to give breaks to the land, breaks to the ocean to regenerate, and they will take time. But there are these other forces as well. One of them is one of the most powerful things we can do. So just to repeat the statistics, humanity has transformed already 2/3 of the landmass of the earth, 75% of the landmass of the earth. We use 1/3 of the land for agriculture. We have imperiled 1 million species, according to the UN. And no matter how precise those numbers are, we've already terraformed the earth. And in the process now, this is all before the next billion people show up in just the next decade. And so one of the most powerful biodiversity conservation things we can do is de-intensify our impacts. Agriculture drives deforestation, and deforestation drives biodiversity loss in many places around the world. If we can grow more food on less land, we can reduce the economic incentive to cut down the next hectare of forest. And that doesn't require us to build a gigantic park. It requires us to solve a parallel problem. So there's a lot of this dark, what we might call sort of dark conservation, that we can do by making other systems more ecologically efficient. Another part of it is, another aspect of this is that we're going to have to coexist. We're going to have to slightly rewild the places that we still live in. Mm-hmm. And one example of this that I think about is this. One of my favorite examples is this program that was created a few years ago. Some of the listeners might know about it, called eBird. It was this initiative where we have migratory birds that move from Canada to Mexico through the Central Valley of California. They're water birds, they're waterfowl, and they need normally places to land in marshland so that they can rest on the way up and the way down. Unfortunately, we've turned all of that into agricultural land. And so by combining citizen science observation, remote sensing technologies, and AI, we're able to create sophisticated models of when the birds are and where they are. And then there was a program set up, I think, by TNC and a few others, where they would go to farmers and ask them they'd create this reverse auction where they'd have farmers temporarily flood their fields. So the incoming birds would have a place to land for a few weeks and then rest and then take off again to the next place, and essentially create pop-up habitats so that we could conserve these populations of animals as they made these migratory gestures. And that's about figuring out how to protect areas and how to conserve areas that commingle with places where human beings can't be, exempted. And that doesn't mean we're not going to do big things too, where we're going to do big set-asides. But the range of tools we have supported by these technologies allow us to have new kinds of conservation verbs that we haven't had before.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, that's a perfect example of how, one sector can get involved in this work, mm-hmm. do it in a way that allows them to kind of continue to pursue what they need to do, right. But be sensitive to the changes that we need to make as a society in order to safeguard biodiversity and address a warming climate. And it's going to happen, and it should happen in a wide variety of sectors. For many years, nonprofit organizations and conservation organizations have looked at ecotourism, for example. Mm-hmm. And said, okay, they're setting aside these little plots of land, these reserves, these trusts, and then people come in, they experience it for a little while, and then they move, and then they go out on their way. And what's happening is now you see tourism reserves starting to connect with each other.
Yeah.
So as they connect with each other, they're starting to say, okay, what lands can we buy in between our reserves that would help mm-hmm. create corridors to create greater connectivity between these species, right. which allows more diversity, right? Or, and that's something that's brilliant as they organize. And I think, again, it's going to be, what they're going to rely on is mapping from technology companies like Planet and Esri and so forth, and Google and Microsoft's work. And they're going to also rely on, again, good old-fashioned organizing, grassroots organizing between their own constituencies in order to develop, to develop a greater impact on this type of conservation.
Sure.
At the Half Earth Project, we have a loose organization of companies that we kind of work with that have that spirit of wanting to protect biodiversity, and they sort of apply it to their business in all different ways. And you brought up this smaller footprint for food and agriculture. And I was thinking immediately about the company App Harvest in Tennessee, which is a company for a Half Earth Future. They are growing delicious tomatoes and all kinds of other veggies in these large warehouses that use, an order of just a huge order of less resources, less water, less light, less soil. And that's going to be a future, and they're pioneering future ways of feeding people that is better for the environment. And we're going to be experiencing some of those things, I think, in the near future, and partly because we have other technologies happening at the same pace, like food delivery systems changing, that are going to make it more possible, to scale some of these solutions up. So it's a really interesting time, because there's no one group or that can solve this problem. It's going to be a whole of society approach as we look across countries. And I keep thinking about, honestly, beer because I've been looking at, I'm a big beer fan, and I know that a lot of breweries are exploring this, and they're doing it from the ground up, right? There's this explosion of great thinking around how to sustainably, basically, create a great brew. And I have a question for you, Mandi, which is, because I know you've been lobbing them all at us, which is, what is Sierra Nevada Brewing doing next that we should be aware of that is going to have a positive impact on biodiversity? And what are other, if other brewers are kind of listening in, what are the tips that you would give them, that relate to how they could use the technology and conservation together?
Thanks, Joel. That's very nice of you. Yeah, I would love to share a little bit. I mean, Sierra Nevada in particular, we're one of the largest craft brewers, which is great because I work with a lot of smaller breweries, and the whole craft industry is just a wonderful group of people. And most of us are very in tune with these issues, and sustainability is something that a lot of breweries think about just in general. And so for us, we've spent a lot of time thinking about our operations and being very efficient. We think a lot about zero waste and water and energy conservation. So we've done that for decades. We've been really focused inside our four walls. And so what we're trying to do now moving forward is thinking outside of our four walls and our whole value chain. And so to your point, we're an ag-based industry, right? We are reliant on hop and barley farmers that pretty much give us what we need to make our products. So as an ag-based industry, as well as all food companies, really, we really should be thinking a lot more about our supply chains and what can we do to partner with our farmers around biodiversity, around land and water conservation, around regenerative ag. So those are all kinds of things that my team is working on moving forward, and thinking about our emissions, setting things like science-based targets and doing our part, again, both in our walls but outside, to move that needle in the right direction, because we sort of need a mass transition to a clean, low carbon economy across all fronts. So that's where I'm focused. So thank you for asking that. Cheers to you. There were a couple more questions that came in that I want to make sure I get to. Harriet is asking, she works for an organization that also uses bioregional mapping to help storytell around coastal biodiversity. A key component for them is partnering with local leadership, especially Indigenous people. What are your thoughts on accelerating this work to involve others besides just more collaboration and more storytelling? So I think what she's getting at, and if I might take a stab at it first, what I like about 30 by 30 in this new conversation is that it is really about what Joel, Andrew, you both have said it, and people in the chat have said it. We really have to just start thinking outside of our own little bubble. So yes, we make a park, or yes, we own a farm. How do those two work together? Because wildlife, biodiversity, climate doesn't care about boundaries or fence lines. So it has to be this interconnection. And 30 by 30 is at least trying to be framed as there's a spot for everybody in that conversation. So if you're for recreation, you're part of 30 by 30. If you hunt and fish, you should understand 30 by 30 and the need for it. If you're in nonprofit and land water conservation, environmental work, you're there. Farmers, you're a part of it. If you own land and you farm, that is part of it. So we need, your land is part of that. So what I really like is that it is trying to be very collaborative and connect all of these stakeholders. So that's my take on it, but I would love to hear what you both think as well.
Well, Joel, I'll step in and then hand it to Joel, perhaps. So in 2019, IPBES, a major UN, part of the UN that covers biodiversity, issued the most comprehensive report released to date up until that time on the global loss of nature, the loss of biodiversity around the world. And they noted that everywhere in the world, biodiversity is being lost. But there was one bright spot, and that one bright spot is where indigenous peoples are given guardianship over vital ecosystems. The rates of biodiversity loss are slowed or sometimes eliminated altogether. So we spend a lot of time talking about technology. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of technocratic fixes and creating governance structures and new laws and new environments and new technologies for monitoring the environment. But we have this one really powerful, very direct observation, which is people who live on the land and live in ways that are in concert with their longstanding indigenous cultural practices are more powerful often than all of those things put together. So but this has also been noted, was noted by IPBES, those indigenous guardians are often, the guardianship is fragile. And the reason it's fragile is because these are areas that are often rich in resources. They're under constant threat from logging and mining and development and climate change. And indigenous peoples do not have the same kinds of respect for their rights and empowerment that many other groups in our global community enjoy. So one of the things we're doing right now, we're actually working really closely with an organization called Niatero. And if you haven't connected with them, you should go check them out. They're amazing. They were started by the original founder of Conservation International, who's now gone on to build this organization, which is governed by indigenous peoples. And working with Niatero and a coalition of technical partners and a huge network of indigenous peoples, we're building a system that takes all of this satellite technology and monitoring the land for change. And we're starting initially across all of Amazonia, and provides the same kinds of real-time insights and data about incursions into indigenous territories built in a system with and not just for indigenous peoples, built in a supportive structure in which we are very much in the background and they are front and center, that gives them the tools to mitigate the impacts of those kinds of incursions and sue and gives them the same informational standing, because data is really unrefined social power. If we give it to people who are best positioned to steward this biodiversity, both in coastal ecosystems and in other places, we think we're going to see really great results. And indeed, there was just a paper published by the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science that followed exactly this approach, giving satellite alerts to indigenous communities in Peru. And those communities were able to reduce rates of deforestation in the first year by 50% in a randomized control trial. So we have real evidence that it works. It's really about changing as much our mental models of who is on the front lines and how we serve them, and switching from this idea that somehow we're on the front lines. What we need to be doing is working to support those indigenous peoples.
And if I'd just add one point to that brilliant answer, Andrew, and those great examples. Education is also a key technology here, right? So if one thing we need to do is make sure that we are continuing to teach and educate the next generation of these stewards, and we need to look broadly, not just at our Western universities and colleges, but also at traditional wisdom and traditional knowledge structures, and see how to bring those into play as well. We know we need more people in scientific careers pursuing the identification of species and also the mapping of those species so that we can have that data. So I would say that's one other element that we need to bring those indigenous voices in on. And I think at that point, I'm all for, and I think the direction that we're heading in is a democratization of a lot of this data.
Yeah, agreed.
And this is perfect because we're a little over, but we've got one more question that I think is great to sort of end on. And you, Joel, already touched on it. I don't know if you happen to see it in the chat, but question about using backgrounds in sustainability and communication and tech to maximize the potential of all three. To your point, Joel, of education and how do we do that best? And so the question really is how could sustainability and marketing teams work with data to help match the public discourse and action to what it should be? And so I kind of like that. And it's touching on what Joel is talking about. And I'll just say personally within Sierra Nevada, we've never really marketed, right, sustainability from a brand standpoint. We don't really talk about it very much. But only in the last couple years are our two teams actually joining forces a little more, which is great. And so I'm kind of not sure why that, at least for us, it's been a little bit of a disconnect for a while. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how do we maximize all of these backgrounds and this technology to get the discourse right.
I think, from the corporate side, because I've spent many years in corporate marketing, corporate advertising, communications, I sort of start by saying, follow the money. So it used to be that this kind of work on the corporate side was done in small pockets in public relations. Over time, as sustainability grew into its own department and then it became integrated into operations and it split off, then the PR departments had to kind of go back around and then understand what the sustainability teams were doing and then promote that out.
Right.
But when it works, when it's firing on all cylinders and when it's working really well, it's actually in the product design itself, where the product is the message. So, whether it's beer or microchips, Teslas or Toyotas, the story has to be embedded in the actual product, right? And so from there out, the use of that product, that then becomes that story. And those, that can be financial products, it can be ag products, it can be, all kinds of things. So I kind of think of it as, rather than, we need great storytelling to sort of solve this problem, I sort of look at it as we need lifestyle change, we need behavior change to solve these big problems. And then we need stories about the behavior change. We need to recognize that we are every day actually, despite the tremendous amount of doom and gloom, moving that much further to solving these problems. We're not behind the eight ball. We're actually moving at a really good pace, in terms of how we're going to work on solving these problems. It's just that we don't always do a good job. And the media doesn't always do a good job talking about the behavior changes that are already happening. Great example is moving to a plant-based diet. This is a wave that is rolling over this country. It's going to soon roll even further. And we know plant-based diets have wide impacts. And even if we move to just increasing a plant-based diet in a mixed diet, that could have positive impacts overall. But how do you tell that story?
Right.
You can tell it in a million different ways. So I think it comes down with behavior change.
So if the product is the importance of land and water conservation or biodiversity loss, we got to figure out how to tell that, like you said, so that it comes through in that message and that product, if you will.
Okay. The species, in a sense, are the story.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one thought to amplify Joel's fantastic message there. The world's best tool is useless in an indifferent hand, right? If you don't care, the thing that is fundamental is a change of heart. And it comes from changes of stories. It comes from the change of narrative. It comes from the ways in which we understand ourselves in a different way. The technologies that we've been describing today, indeed all technologies and all instruments of discovery, scientific discovery eventually become tools of moral discovery, because they reshape our understanding of how we relate to the whole.
Right.
And so, I think these technologies form a kind of moral mirror that we are holding up to humanity. And ultimately, we must encourage the change in belief, the change in self-understanding, and ultimately, this, I think, the most powerful tool, or the most powerful idea there, is one of kinship. It's that we're related to all of the rest of the complex web of life. We're all cousins. We're all connected, and this idea that you wouldn't kill your family, and in the same way, we have to have, if we understand those kinship relationships, that's the beginning of a change of heart. And technologies can help us see those.
I was just going to say that brings us kind of full circle back to our original conversation around, if you look at the Half Earth Project maps on the halfearthproject.com, I think, Joel, I might have that wrong, but you guys can find it if you Google Half Earth Project. You can see, you can drill down, you can visualize, you can make it internal, personal, you can go down to local level. And so to your point, Andrew, that's kind of what started the whole conversation, was like this, the technology allows us to bring it internal, you understand it, you become part of that web and that story. And that's really why it's kind of essential and critical to be able to bring both together. I don't think we have, wanted to make sure I didn't miss any other questions. We're over, so I don't want to keep people too long in case you're trying to get to another session. Joel, Andrew, any final thoughts?
I guess I'll just share that, yes, you can go to halfearthproject.org with hyphen between the half and project. Or you can Google us and you'll find a lot of interesting information about what the Half Earth Project is, the inspiration behind 30 by 30, and the Half Earth Project map, which, as you said, Mandi, allows you to explore basically the areas that are protected and the areas where we need to protect more so that we can safeguard biodiversity.
Great.
I really appreciate that. I think one of the great things here is the community that you're building. And the first thing we really need is each other. So I would just say to the people who have been participating today, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out on LinkedIn, reach out on all these two platforms and say hello, because it's the most powerful thing we can do is take these ideas and think about them together and work on them together. So we'd love to hear from you if you're interested in those things. And thank you again, Mandi, for wonderful facilitation of our discussions. And thank you
very much, Mandi. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you both. I've learned so much just in the last few months or so that we've been talking about Half Earth, about E.O. Wilson, about Planet. So I encourage everyone also to explore both organizations. It's been really great. I've, again, learned a lot myself. So yeah, hope everyone has a great rest of the conference and sessions. Cheers to you all. Thank you so much, Andrew and Joel. And we will see you all soon.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.